perspective presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow. Hello again, and thanks for being with us. I'm Harry Greenberger. I'm the host for the show. We have a very interesting program set up for today, and our guest is John V. Barry, who is
it's my email.
Okay, who has written a book on church-state separation, and I would like to say that we, as non-religious people, are particularly interested in the separation of church and state. But this aspect of our Constitution has been equally beneficial to the churches because they have proliferated in this country as they have not anywhere else. But John, I'm going to just first ask you, how did you become interested in this topic?
Well, first, the book won't be out until sometime probably March or April 2012. Right now we're taping this well in advance of that. I'm about to turn in the edited manuscript in a couple of weeks. The topic actually, it's about the genesis of the idea of separation of church and state, which goes back to the 1600s and the first New England settlements and the Puritans coming over in English constitutional history. And the way I really got into it goes back to my second book, which was Rising Tide, which a lot of people in New Orleans know.
And the topic of that book?
That was about the 1927 flood, of course, and you know, there was a chapter in that book in advance of the flood. It was about the home front in World War I, and I was always interested in 1919, which seemed to me to be one of the most divisive and explosive years in American history. And I planned to do my next book. There was chapter 10 in Rising Tide. I planned to do my next book on the home front in World War I and culminating in the explosive nature of 1919. And I had figured out which characters I was going to focus on. One of them was going to be Billy Sunday, who was the first evangelist to hit the big cities. And in fact, Elmer Gantry is based on Billy Sunday. And as I started to think more about it, I started to think, well, if I want to get into the question of religion's role in America, then I should go back to the beginning. And the beginning, of course, is John Winthrop, who made the speech, City on a Hill speech, and Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island on the basis of absolute, total separation of church and state. And
but no, this came after the Puritans came over,
right? Well,
because originally the original groups that came here, religion was a part of their government, wasn't it?
Oh, very much so in Massachusetts. And Williams, in fact, was a minister. He was no secular humanist. And the reason he was actually considered the Puritans hypocrites. And he was for total separation because he felt any contact between the church and state would corrupt the church. You know, the saying that when you mix politics and religion, you get politics. That's obviously a saying today. He didn't put it in those words, but that's what he felt.
I like that comment, but it isn't very well recognized today, is it?
Well, a lot of people recognize it, but it's not the.
It's not prevailing.
It's not prevailing. Anyway. The other interesting thing about Williams, and Williams he was a friend of Oliver Cromwell. He taught John Milton Dutch. I mean, he was an extremely accomplished person. He went back and forth between America and England several times after he came here. He became a major player in the development of the concept of toleration in England. But he had been the protege of someone who arguably is the most important lawyer in English history. His name was Sir Edward Coke. Nobody knows his name, but everybody in America knows one of his best-known lines, which was, "Every Englishman's home is his castle." Yes. And Coke, when Roger Williams was a young boy, 13, 14, 15 years old, he was sort of his amanuensis, and Coke basically went to war with King James over constitutional rights. The English constitutional, people don't realize how much of the U.S. Constitution comes directly from English constitutional history. And even though they never had a written constitution the way we did, they had common law. And Edward Coke was king of the common law. He was what was referred to as Chief Justice of England. He was Chief Justice of the King's Bench, and although King James fired him from that and sent him to the Tower because he opposed him. And the interesting thing, you look back in the early 1600s, they had serious religious terrorism. They had religious wars in Europe. In England today, they still celebrate Guy Fawkes Day. Guy Fawkes was a terrorist who he put gunpowder, tons of gunpowder, underneath the Parliament and planned to blow it up with the king in it. And they discovered that plot just before he was getting ready to execute it. So you have, and he was a Catholic, and of course England was Protestant, and you had those tensions. King James's mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was executed for plotting against Queen Elizabeth, and his father had been murdered as well. Anyway, even in this context of real religious terrorism, real threats to the state, plus the foreign enemy of Spain, the Spanish Armada, and so forth, even in that context, Edward Coke insisted that things like habeas corpus be honored. Every time, and King James sort of injected the idea of the divine right of kings into English history, and Coke would stand up and say that is not part of the English constitutional tradition, and then James and his son Charles would argue that national security, and the phrase they used was reason of state, gave them the rights to put somebody in prison even without charges. Coke would insist that was not the case, and so forth and so on. And to put it in Coke's phrase, he said, reason of state lames Magna Carta. In other words, it cripples Magna Carta, it cripples all the freedoms that Englishmen had been accustomed to. And as Coke was going to the Tower for standing up to the king on things like habeas corpus and the rights of Parliament, Williams was working for him and was extremely influenced by him. So he came out of the two traditions. One was the idea of freedom, and the rights of individuals, the idea that in your own home you can do what you want, the Parliament has rights and so forth. And at the same time, Puritans in England were being persecuted by the church hierarchy. The Puritans did not come to America for freedom of religion. They came for freedom of their religion. They immediately set up a state at least as persecutorial, if I can use that word, as the English hierarchy had been. In fact, if you were an Anglican, a high church Anglican, you could not worship in Massachusetts. You were kicked out of Massachusetts. And Williams did go to Massachusetts, but he immediately felt and declared that he didn't quite get to this point at the beginning, but he said, the first 4 commandments of the 10 Commandments are referred to as the first table, and those relate to the relationship between humans and God. The second ones are between humans and humans, and the Massachusetts authorities believe that they should enforce the first table, and that is really the essence of the separation of church and state, that argument over the first table of the 10 Commandments and the second, and Williams said no.
There are groups of people today who insist that our government is based on the 10 Commandments. They haven't learned anything in these 2 centuries, have they?
In this case, 4 centuries.
Yes.
Yeah, this starts in, Williams came to America in 1630.
I was thinking back to the writing of the Constitution.
Yeah, I understand, but the point is this actually goes before
sure.
that. And the argument started then. And it's obviously continued today. I think the point that the intersection or interweaving of freedom with freedom of religion is so essential and so misunderstood. If you believe in freedom, then you believe in freedom of thought. And if you believe in freedom of thought, then you have to believe in separation of church and state. You have to. Or to quote another of Cook's lines, he said very simple. He quoted it in Latin, thought is free. You can't be, part of the other issue of the rights was they would, not in common law courts, but they had a parallel court system, and they would force people to answer questions. If they didn't answer questions, they went to jail. And so you would incriminate yourself. Another tradition of common law is that can't be forced to testify against yourself.
You have the right to remain silent.
Yes, and that's obviously part of the American Constitution and the Bill of Rights and so forth. So all these things are part of this story, and I don't think too many Americans realize how far back and how ingrained that is, and it does go directly back to the separation of church and state. It goes back to it in the 17th century when that fight really began, and ultimately there was, of course, a civil war in England, and the King Charles, James's son, was beheaded.
Well, from that early time up to the revolution in this country and our new Constitution, how did all of that progress and develop?
The argument continued hasn't stopped. Rhode Island was considered an outcast society. And it was tolerating Quakers, excuse me, for example, when Quakers were being hung in Massachusetts. And New Amsterdam, now New York, of course, the Dutch had a tradition of tolerance, but it wasn't separation, it wasn't full tolerance. Even the Dutch would not tolerate Quakers, and they would go to Rhode Island. So people throughout the American colonies were certainly well aware of this tradition, and they were well aware of Roger Williams. Williams, in fact, is the first person that I know of to use the phrase wall of separation, and he used it 150 years before Thomas Jefferson, although it's not so unusual a phrase that Jefferson might not have come up with it independently. But Williams' position was well known, and in addition, he was also an early Baptist, and the whole movement of Baptists in America for freedom sort of promoted Roger Williams's views. And it was known at the time we were writing the Constitution that when Baptists or Roger Williams were talking about separation, church and state, they meant it. You know, they meant total separation. And again, Williams separated the idea of God from the church, you know, because the church is man's interpretation of God.
Yes, we understand.
So therefore, you are virtually guaranteed to be in error because people make mistakes. Now, you know, Williams was extremely devout. The whole concept was God doesn't make a mistake, but as soon as you get humans involved, you get error and corruption. And because no one can know what was right, what God truly meant, then you have to allow for error.
Now, at the time of the Constitutional Convention, you know, the writing of the Constitution, I seem to recall that even at that time, not a large percentage of the population in the colonies actually were going to church, and that many of the leaders whom we know were deists rather than theists. So at the time of the writing of the Constitution, how powerful were the religious forces?
Well, I prefer not getting into that because I don't consider myself an expert on that.
All right.
You know, I want to make one other point that's really kind of interesting. Another player in the game in the early 1600s and another major influence on Williams was Francis Bacon, who we know today as, you know, one of the developers of the idea of scientific methodology.
All right.
And you know, he deplored Aristotle's logic because Aristotle did not experiment. And in the history of science, you know, Bacon is one of the great giants of the time. But Bacon was also a courtier and Chancellor of England and an arch rival of Edward Coke. And Bacon supported the idea of the divine right of kings because he was in James's pocket. He relied on James for his position and his wealth. But Bacon, at the same time, because of his insistence in the natural world on looking at actual evidence, and Williams read Bacon and knew Bacon, although he was, as I say, only a teenager at the time when he was around Bacon. Bacon had a tremendous influence on him, and the key was that unlike basically everybody else in the 17th century, and frankly a lot of people today, Williams looked at evidence. You know, the idea in the 17th century was that God chose England and blessed England as a special place. And the proof of it was things like the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And of course, we think the same thing about our country today.
Well,
a lot of people do.
And when you mention the divine right of kings and God, when our Constitution was written, it was not written under the authority or the aegis of kings or gods, but it was written by the consent of the governed. And we do have, at least on paper, a truly secular government setup.
Right.
Which was the intention, and then that takes us to the First Amendment to the Constitution, which is, if we're going to talk about church-state separation, that's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah. And
right.
Let me finish about the thought about Bacon, though. What Roger Williams did was look around the world, and he pointed out that if God only blessed Protestants, and particularly Puritan Protestants, why were Puritans having such a hard time in England? Why were, at the moment in the 30 Years' War, the Catholic armies were defeating Protestant forces? And why were Muslims, why was Turkey, you know, why was that thriving economically? And he pointed out, he said there was no reason why a government official, why a Christian magistrate, government official, would be any better as a government official than a Muslim, a Jew, or for that matter, a pagan. He dealt a lot with Native Americans, so he was quite familiar with pagans. One of the other things that's very unusual about Williams is basically everybody else at the time who talked about toleration, most of them excluded Catholics. All of them, except Williams, excluded atheists. John Locke's essay on toleration, atheists were completely excluded, and Locke was not exactly kind to Catholics either. So these people, and John Milton was all part of that mix. I don't know how much of Milton you've read, but Milton was a revolutionary in addition to writing Paradise Lost. And also for toleration. But even John Milton, who was probably second to Roger Williams in terms of his extreme position, even Milton was against tolerating atheists. Now, Williams never explicitly said he'd tolerate atheists, but he never said he would not, and everyone else explicitly excluded atheists. And in fact, the whole concept of toleration he opposed, because toleration kind of presumes that someone's in power and is allowing someone else to do something, and you can always withdraw that permission. And he came at it from a different position. If government has no role, then there's no question about toleration. It's a completely different issue.
I hear what you're saying. Now, before we run out of time, because this program goes very fast, I'd like to sort of bring us more up to date and get your view on church-state separation today.
Well, I'm for it. Let's put it simply.
But we are having problems.
Obviously, we are. I think there are people who believe today exactly what John Winthrop believed 400 years ago, that the theocracy that's what they want. John Winthrop even, frankly, would have been appalled by the idea of putting a cross in a public building. Even Winthrop wouldn't have gone for that, even though, without question, he believed that the state should enforce. In Massachusetts, they even executed people for adultery. That was not English law. And when they came to America, they wrote what they called a Mosaic Code based on the Old Testament. And there are people today who come fairly close to that position, remarkably close,
and would like to see our government to take that position. I like to quote, and I will here, because we do have the First Amendment, which is not crystal clear, but it implies that government should stay out of religion and vice versa. And when the question got to the Supreme Court back in 1947, Justice Hugo Black wrote these words, and I'm not going to do his whole opinion. He said, "The establishment of religion clause of the First Amendment means at least this: neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. Neither can pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. Neither can force nor influence a person to go to or to remain away from a church against his will, or to force him to profess a belief or disbelief in any religion." Now, that is so clear to me, and yet we see this being violated right and left, and particularly in the recent decade, including such things as when George Bush set up the aid to what's it called, the
parochial schools.
they're giving federal money to religious organizations.
Faith organizations, right.
Yeah. And actually, when George Bush wanted the Congress to pass a bill that would do that, they refused, and so he did it by executive order. Mm-hmm. And money has been going to religious organizations.
Well,
unfortunately, our current president, Barack Obama, I have something here. As president, he established a new President's Council for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, and so our tax dollars are still going to church, religious organizations. How can that be happening?
Well, go to court over that. I would say, not so much to address that, but I think it's clear. And if you go back to the history, as I did, not just 200 years, but 400 years, if you are for freedom, and a lot of these people who claim to be most religious claim to be the most patriotic, but if you are for real freedom, then you are for freedom of thought. And if you are for freedom of thought, then you absolutely have to be for freedom of religion.
Well, those are actually named as the guarantees of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble. It's in there. That is what we're supposedly living by, and I agree.
But
that
too many people.
They didn't say freedom of thought, but that follows. But actually, I don't know. How can you control thought anyway? Who can take away your freedom to think?
Well, you can, as soon as you, obviously it's tied up with freedom of speech. In fact, Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts, and they told him, if you simply stay quiet, we won't banish you. And in those days, banishment meant you could not come back. Banishment, if you came back, you were risking your life. Yes. The reason they hung the Quakers was because the Quakers were banished, told you can't come back. They came back, they were hung. And they told Williams, and they told the Quakers, you can live here. You can think whatever you want, but just don't open your mouth about it.
Okay.
If you don't open your mouth, then we'll tolerate you. We actually don't persecute anybody.
So they did have freedom of thought.
That's exactly correct.
And I exercise that all the time. And you do too. You've been thinking about your book and
trying to get it into the conversation. You want to talk about 200 years later.
All right. Well, listen. We got about 2 minutes. I want to let you talk about your book.
Well, to put it that way, 2 minutes to talk about. Ask me another question.
Well, in fact,
I would say, the music's starting. Maybe we don't have 2 minutes.
All right. Well, I just want to thank you for being here, and we're going to
give the title.
And we're going to do this again. Okay. I want to thank you folks for watching our show. You will see an interesting program every week on Channel 76 and also on the NOSHA website, which is nosha.org. Come see us again.